this is going to be the last comparison I do of two vampire movies for this month. And for this unofficial trilogy of reviews, I'm going to cap it off with what is considered to be one of the greatest vampire movies ever made. And that is the classic 2008 film, Let the Right One In. And yes, that is fairly recent for a movie to be considered classic, but, when I started hearing about this movie and started hearing that it was like the best vampire movie ever, and finally got around to seeing it, I definitely thought it was worth the hype, and I think it deserves status as sort of an instant classic. There are a couple of vampire movies that I like better, but if I were to make a top 10 list, this would for sure have to make it up there somewhere. And then right after I saw it, I found out that they were going to remake this movie in America, and I was thinking, oh god, not again. Hollywood's making another remake for American audiences of this great foreign film. It's most likely than not going to suck. Although not all of them have been remakes of great films. I didn't really care for Pulse or One Missed Call, but anyway, putting that aside, I found out that it was being done by the same guy who made Cloverfield, which gave me some hope because I am one of the people who actually likes that movie. And then once the DVD came out, there was a little quote by Stephen King on the front saying that it was one of the scariest films of the past decade, and to me, Stephen King's word is golden, so I finally got around to watching the American version, and it was actually pretty good. But like I've been doing, I'm going to talk first about what the original did better. And first of all, I know that some people might consider this to be an unnecessary subplot, but I like how they did this sort of neighborhood group of friends in the original. And when one of them ends up being attacked by the vampire and then later dies, it feels like it has a lot more emotional weight to it. And there's also that terrifying scene with the cats. In the remake, they sort of remake this character as a much younger person who the main character is spying on through his window. She ends up being attacked and then dies, and her death scene is pretty terrifying, but it doesn't have nearly as much emotional weight to it, so I definitely prefer how they did that character in the original film. Also, I like how the vampire's assistant was portrayed in the original film, and there's not really a huge difference, but in the American version, he's a lot more quiet and comes off as kind of cold, and he's supposed to he's supposed to be a character that you kind of feel sorry for, even though, of course, you're not rooting for him. In the original, there were just a lot of subtle moments that made him feel more human and more sympathetic for me. Hang on. And then this is kind of a matter of personal bias, but I kind of prefer the way that the boy was portrayed in the original film. And he does have, certain aspects to bring in the remake. He's a lot creepier in the American version. He comes off as more of a serial killer in the making at parts, especially when you're first introduced to him. And aside from that, I've also mentioned that he spies on his neighbor. There's also a point where he steals from his mother. He's not the most likable character, but the fact that he has all of these flaws do make him interesting in his own right. But in the original, I feel like I was able to identify with him a little more just on a personal level, because he was a lot less confident. He felt much more vulnerable and human. And, despite the fact that he does have these scenes where he's fantasizing about getting revenge on these bullies, I thought just like that when I was in, middle school for the most part. It didn't really happen nearly as much in elementary school. High school, it kind of petered off, but, when I was in middle school, that was kind of the height of just how often I would think violent thoughts about people, even though I never acted on them. But yeah, as disturbing as that is, I prefer the boy in the original film just for how much I was able to connect with him. And then the most important character in both of these movies, the one which makes both Let the Right One In and Let Me In horror movies, is the vampire. And I do like the way that Chloe Moretz plays her in Let Me In, the American version. She plays it off as much more sad and vulnerable. And there were little moments which I thought were done better with her, like the scene where she tries a piece of candy, I thought was done better in the American version. And I also liked how her voice became much deeper and had a lot more baritone to it when she became angry with her assistant. But I prefer the way that this character was done overall in the original because she gave a much better impression of being an old soul trapped in this small body. And I also thought she was a lot scarier in the Swedish film. Like, whenever she's killing someone, I liked how they did it with these wide shots and how it was usually much quieter. They didn't need to make it loud and bloody and brutal. Plus, the CGI was a little less obvious. It was definitely more obvious with the American film. Plus, I didn't like how Chloe Moretz would be screaming when she was attacking someone. And for one thing, it didn't even sound scary. For another thing, it wouldn't make sense for her to scream when killing someone because wouldn't that just attract attention? Um, and then there were, little subtle touches to the original that I liked, like whenever she was hungry for blood, the vampire would be making these throaty animal sounds. And, an even smaller touch that I liked was this one scene where she was in the dark and this light was reflecting off of her eyes just like a cat's eyes. Just little things like that made her a lot better in the original, in my personal opinion. So, getting into what I think that the remake did better, first of all, I think that they did a better job at establishing the conflict between the boy's parents. Now, in both movies, his mom and dad are going through a divorce, and in the original, his mom just generally seems like a nice lady, and there's really not much to her. And then there's a scene where he's visiting his dad, and suddenly this guy comes into the room, and then his dad's all depressed, and he gets out some vodka to drink, and I really have no idea what was going on in that scene. Uh, was this like his new gay lover or something? Was he ashamed of this relationship? Uh, I know they don't necessarily need to spoon feed the audience with everything, but it's one of those moments where it just felt like a film was keeping you at arm's length when it came to kind of withholding information. Um, in the American version, Let Me In, his mother seems a lot more pathetic, and in the first, I think it was the first scene that you were introduced to her, she was actually drinking while they were sitting together at dinner, and there's one, you never actually see his father, but there's one scene where he's talking to him on the phone, and you definitely get the impression that the guy just hates his mother as a person, and he goes on this kind of rant about her being a religious freak and everything. So there was definitely much more of an established conflict between the two. Also, I think that the bullies are done much better in Let Me In. In the original, they just kind of get the job done as this group of characters that you as an audience member are supposed to hate. But in the remake, they just feel much more real. For one thing, when they're attacking the main character, it's a lot more violent and it's a lot more upsetting to watch. And also, the leader of the group talks more like an actual kid in the American film. When I was watching this same character in the Swedish movie, he felt more just like a movie villain. Like he had these narrow eyes, he would talk more quietly and kind of have a smirk on his face. It didn't feel nearly as natural as in the American film. Plus, they go after other kids. They don't just mess with this one boy, which makes sense. Why would they make him their only target, which is what they did in the original? So points definitely go to the remake for how they portrayed the bullies. So, in the end, Let the Right One In is definitely a movie that was worth my time. It was worth buying on DVD, and a few people have listed it as one of the best horror remakes, and I can see why. It's definitely not a bad film, but just on the whole, for, having more fleshed out characters with the exception of the bullies and the kids' parents, I personally prefer Let the Right One In. I do think it is a superior film. But given the fact that it is a Swedish movie with subtitles, those of you who don't like reading subtitles will definitely prefer the American film. And it does come recommended because there are a lot of things to enjoy about it. There is an English dubbed version available on the DVD for Let the Right One In, but don't watch that version. It's one of the worst English dubs I've ever heard. Anyway, that's really all I've got to say about this comparison. I hope you all have a good one.